What if the only way to prove you were worthy was to be perfect? Imagine you're a fighter pilot in the deadliest war in history, but your greatest enemy isn't the one in the sky in front of you. It's the prejudice of the commanders behind you, who have set you up in a cruel experiment designed for you to fail. This isn't just a story about war. It's the story of how a group of men, denied the respect of their own country, flew with such discipline and courage that they achieved the impossible. A combat record so flawless, it became a legend that could no longer be denied. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're climbing into the cockpit to tell the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. We'll uncover how they were forced to invent a radical new tactic out of sheer necessity, why they painted their tails bright red in an act of defiance, and how they earned a reputation as the Red Tail Angels by never losing a single bomber to an enemy fighter. The truth is more powerful than any myth. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but in the halls of power, steeped in the bitter reality of 1940s America. The year is 1941, the world is on fire, and America is about to be thrown into the inferno of the Second World War. It needs every soldier, sailor, and airman it can get, but its military is crippled by a deeply ingrained, officially sanctioned belief that African Americans were incapable of flying and fighting in combat aircraft. For 2 decades, the Army Air Corps had insisted, with the certainty of scientific fact, that African Americans lacked the intelligence, the courage, or the reflexes for the lethal ballet of aerial combat. But not everyone was buying it. In April 1941, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt visited the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Against the frantic protests of her Secret Service detail, she requested a flight with the chief civilian instructor, a brilliant black aviator named Charles Chief Anderson. For 40 minutes, they soared over the Alabama countryside. When they landed, she turned to him and said with a smile, "Well, I see you can fly all right." That flight became a national news story, and she began to put quiet, immense pressure on her husband's administration. The result was Public Law 18, a piece of legislation that forced the War Department's hand. It mandated the creation of an all-black flying unit, whether the military brass liked it or not, and they did not like it, not one bit. In an act of malicious compliance, the Army Air Corps selected Tuskegee, Alabama, as the training ground. This was no accident. It was the heart of Jim Crow territory, isolated, rural, and far from the prying eyes of the northern press. Their logic was cold and cynical. If this experiment is going to fail, and we fully expect it to fail, it will happen quietly, out of sight. When Tuskegee Army Airfield opened in July 1941, it was a testament to sabotage disguised as opportunity. The equipment was junk that other bases had rejected. The runways were shorter. The aircraft were worn out, second-hand trainers. The maintenance facilities were makeshift shacks. Everything about the setup screamed, "We are giving you a chance, but we are making sure you can possibly succeed." The first class of 13 aviation cadets arrived to a hostile environment. Their white instructors had been told to expect these students to wash out at triple the rate of white cadets. Leading this first class was a man forged in the institutional racism of Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. The son of the Army's first black general, he had endured 4 years at West Point, where not a single white cadet spoke to him outside of official duties. 4 years of total, enforced silence. He had learned to endure, to excel not despite the pressure, but because of it. Now he faced a test that was even more profound, proving that black men could master the most technologically demanding form of combat in existence. The training was deliberately, punishingly brutal. At other bases, white cadets got multiple chances to pass check rides. At Tuskegee, you got one. A white cadet struggling with navigation would receive remedial instruction. A Tuskegee cadet showing the slightest weakness was eliminated. The system was engineered to produce a catastrophic failure rate. But something happened that the brass had never anticipated. These men refused to break. They studied harder, flew with more precision, and supported each other through a crucible designed to tear them apart.
On March 7th, 1942, the impossible happened. 5 men from that first class earned their silver wings. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was among them. The Army Air Corps now had a problem. The experiment had succeeded. They had no choice but to continue the program. They had overcome the first hurdle, proving they could fly. But soon, they would face a far deadlier test in the skies over Europe, where the enemy wasn't just armed with machine guns, but with the full weight of the Luftwaffe. If you're fascinated by these stories of overcoming impossible odds, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss where this journey takes us. By mid-1943, enough pilots had graduated to form the 332nd Fighter Group, composed of 4 squadrons. But this was segregation in its purest form. Every pilot, every mechanic, every crew chief, every single supply officer was black. The Army had created a self-contained, completely segregated combat group, betting that it would collapse under its own weight once the chaos of real war began. The equipment they were issued tells you everything you need to know about the Army's expectations. While white fighter groups were receiving the latest, most powerful P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, the 332nd was given hand-me-down P-40 Warhawks. This was a plane that was a legend in 1941 with the Flying Tigers in China, but by 1943 it was a relic. It was slower, less maneuverable, and mechanically exhausted. They were being sent to fight the Luftwaffe's latest and greatest fighters in a vintage aircraft. The unspoken message was clear. Fly your token missions, prove our prejudices right, and fade into history as a failed experiment. Colonel Davis took command, knowing his men would be judged by an impossible standard. When white pilots lost bombers, it was the unfortunate fog of war. If his men lost bombers, it would be presented as definitive proof that an entire race was unfit for combat. The pressure was suffocating. These weren't just fighter pilots. They were the carriers of the hopes and dreams of 13 million black Americans. Every takeoff was a political statement. Every successful landing was a refutation of scientific racism. In June 1943, they shipped out to North Africa. Real combat was coming, and an entire nation was watching, waiting for them to fail.
The 99th Fighter Squadron tasted combat for the first time on June 2, 1943, over the skies of Sicily. Their first mission, escorting medium bombers, went smoothly. No enemy contact, just nervous pilots learning the terrifying sight of anti-aircraft flak bursting around them, trying to kill them. But the honeymoon ended fast. A week later, they encountered German Focke-Wulf 190s, and Lieutenant Charles Hall scored the unit's first aerial victory. But their obsolete P-40s were a death sentence. The FW-190 could outclimb it by 500 feet per minute. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 could outturn it at high altitude. The Tuskegee pilots were flying antiques into a modern war, forced to rely on pure skill to survive. On July 2, 1943, everything nearly fell apart. During a mission over Sicily, the 99th was jumped by a dozen Bf-109s diving out of the sun. It was a textbook ambush. 2 P-40s were shot down in flames. One pilot was killed, another captured. The recriminations were immediate and vicious. Colonel William Maumier, a white commander, filed a scathing report claiming the 99th lacked aggressive spirit and demonstrated inferior combat effectiveness. The report landed on the desk of General Hap Arnold with a recommendation: pull them from combat. The experiment was being officially labeled a failure. What Maumier's report conveniently left out was that his own white squadrons flying the same P-40s were also getting slaughtered. But when white pilots died, it was bad luck. When black pilots died, it was evidence of genetic inferiority. Colonel Davis, knowing his men were one bad mission away from being disbanded, requested an audience with the top brass. In September 1943, he walked into the meeting armed with data. He proved, statistically, that his men were performing identically to white squadrons cursed with the same outdated planes. The generals didn't promote him, but they didn't ground the 99th either. Instead, with the strategic bombing campaign over Germany hemorrhaging crews, they made a pragmatic decision. They needed every fighter they could get. The entire 332nd Fighter Group was ordered to Italy, and they were finally going to get modern aircraft. This was the turning point. They had survived the sabotage, the prejudice, and the test of combat in inferior machines. Now, they were getting a real chance and a new weapon, the legendary P-51 Mustang. The decisions they would make with these new planes would change aviation history forever. We pour hundreds of hours of research into these documentaries, and your support by hitting that subscribe button allows us to keep telling these vital stories.
In January 1944, the 332nd arrived at Ramitelli Airfield on Italy's Adriatic coast. First, they got P-47 Thunderbolts, massive rugged fighters the pilots called Jugs. But by May, they transitioned to the plane that would define their legend, the P-51 Mustang. With its Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and revolutionary laminar flow wings, the P-51 was a game-changer. It was fast, agile, and most importantly, it had the range to escort heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But with this new plane came a new politically explosive mission: full-time bomber escort. This meant black pilots would be directly responsible for the lives of thousands of white bomber crewmen. Colonel Davis knew the stakes. He gathered his squadron commanders and laid out a new doctrine, born of necessity. It was simple, it was radical, and it violated everything American fighter pilots were taught. "You will stay with the bombers," he ordered. "You will not chase glory kills. You will bring those crews home." Standard American doctrine encouraged fighter pilots to be aggressive hunters. They were to seek and destroy enemy aircraft, even if it meant leaving the bombers temporarily exposed. The theory was that a dead German fighter can't attack a bomber. This doctrine created aces, heroes on magazine covers with high kill counts. But it was also getting bomber crews slaughtered. German pilots had learned to use decoy formations to lure the American escorts away, and then have a larger force swoop in to attack the now defenseless bombers. Davis saw the flaw. His pilots couldn't afford the luxury of chasing personal glory. Any bomber lost on their watch would be a mark against the entire race. So he threw the doctrine in the garbage. His pilots would fly a close escort, staying within visual range, sometimes just yards from the bomber's wingtips. It was physically and mentally exhausting, requiring a level of sustained discipline most pilots would find maddeningly boring. But it was about to make them legends. To make sure everyone, friend and foe, knew exactly who they were, Davis ordered the entire tail assembly of their P-51s to be painted bright fire engine red, an unmistakable calling card. In the skies over Europe, they would now be known as the Red Tails.
The bomber crews noticed almost immediately. They were used to their escorts disappearing, chasing German fighters over the horizon. But these red tails, they stayed. They were a constant, comforting presence, a shield of red-tailed angels weaving between the lumbering bomber formations. Word spread like wildfire through the bomber bases. A rumor, then a belief, then a legend. The red tails have never lost a bomber. It wasn't entirely true. A few bombers were lost to flak or mechanical failure on their watch, but the core of the legend was fact. From June 1944 to the end of the war, not a single bomber under their direct protection was lost to an enemy fighter. 0.
Imagine the psychological impact of that. For bomber crews with a 1 in 3 chance of surviving their tour, seeing those red tails was like being granted a second life. The story of their most famous mission proves just how effective this strategy was. If you want to support our mission to uncover more incredible stories like this, please hit that subscribe button. It truly makes all the difference. The legend of the Red Tails was cemented on March 24, 1945. The mission was a maximum-range escort to Berlin to strike the Daimler-Benz Tank Works. It was a brutal 600-mile flight deep into the heart of the Reich. Near the target, the formation was attacked by the Luftwaffe's secret weapon, Messerschmitt Me-262s, the world's first operational jet fighters. These jets were over 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51s. Conventional wisdom said a propeller plane couldn't touch them. But the Red Tails didn't follow conventional wisdom. They didn't break formation and give chase, which would have been suicide. Instead, they stuck to their doctrine. They stayed with the bombers, positioning themselves between the jets and their flock. They forced the faster Me-262s into a turning fight, negating their speed advantage and forcing them to make mistakes. In the swirling dogfight that followed, the Tuskegee Airmen shot down 3 of the German jets. And every single bomber they were tasked with protecting made it home. The war ended in May 1945. The 332nd Fighter Group returned to the United States with a record that was undeniable. Over 15,000 individual sorties, 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, 96 distinguished flying crosses, and the most effective bomber escort record of any fighter group in the 15th Air Force. But America wasn't ready to celebrate its black heroes. There were no ticker tape parades. The mainstream press largely ignored them. The pilots returned to a country where they still had to use separate water fountains and couldn't eat in the same restaurants as the white bomber crews whose lives they had saved. But you can't bury the truth forever. Their perfect record became a powerful weapon in the civil rights movement. When segregationists argued against integrating the military, the story of the 332nd was the irrefutable counter-argument. How can you claim a race is inferior when they have proven superior performance under the most objective measurement possible, combat success? In 1948, President Harry C. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the armed forces. The discipline and sacrifice of the Tuskegee Airmen had provided the undeniable proof that made that order possible. Their tactical legacy is just as profound. The stay with the bombers principle that Colonel Davis pioneered out of necessity became standard Air Force doctrine. Today, when fighter pilots train for escort missions, they are learning the lessons forged in fire by men who weren't supposed to be capable of flying at all.
In 2007, the surviving Tuskegee Airmen were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. Standing in the Capitol Rotunda, old men in their 80s and 90s, wearing their distinctive red blazers, they finally received the nation's highest civilian honor. It wasn't a perfect ending, and it didn't erase decades of discrimination, but it was recognition. It was an admission that their service mattered, and their record of excellence had changed the nation and the world. Thank you for joining me on this powerful story of courage and discipline. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't just fight a war, they fought two, one against fascism abroad and another against racism at home. They won both. Their legacy isn't just about what they did in the air. It's about the standards they set, the barriers they shattered, and the proof they offered that excellence knows no color. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. Your support is what makes all of this possible. We'll see you in the next one.